Hello to other virtual participants, wherever you are. I'm Stephen Hugh from Baylor University, although originally from Toronto, Canada, and I'll begin reading through my paper, Adding Faith to Martial Arts and Combat to Orthodoxy in Putin's Russia. In 2013, Anatoly Khlepetsky prefaced his hybrid biographical study, And the Eternal Battle, St. Nikolai of Japan and the Origins of the Martial Arts of Russia, with the statement, quote, Sambo. I'm sure that a century ago, St. Nikolai of Japan, by God's will, blessed the creation of this martial art for the good and glory of Russia, end quote. And through more than 500 pages, the text displays this interest in connecting these things, St. Nikolai and Sambo, and however successfully, it plays a foundational role in the beginning of a Russian Orthodox Church, or ROC, effort to appropriate Sambo and promote an Orthodox iteration of the martial art during the 2010s. Recent scholarship on ROC links to martial arts, like that of French political scientist Marlène Laruelle, has emphasized the claims of military patriotic clubs or self-proclaimed militias to have church sanction for their activities, including martial arts and armed combat training. Rather than take the claims of those outside groups at face value, this paper focuses on how the ROC has presented its relationship to martial arts, and especially Sambo, in the media since Patriarch Kirill was elected to lead the church in 2009. To consider this process, I draw from two sets of online Russian language sources, ROC media presentations of Sambo, and then secular media outlets' coverage. Drawing from mediatization theory and analytical frameworks to martial arts studies, I focus on three questions in my analysis. As you see there, how has the ROC explained the ideological and theological compatibility of Sambo to orthodoxy? Why has the ROC decided to focus on Sambo over other martial arts or other sports? And what practical contributions has the ROC made to promote Sambo? In answering them, I argue that the Russian Orthodox Church presents itself as the source of a discursively distinct and institutionally parallel Sambo youth movement that fills a void in state-centered efforts without any role, that is by the Church, in paramilitary mobilization campaigns. In Khlepetsky's church-sanctioned 21st century narrative of Sambas Origins, rediscoveries of forgotten Russian combat lore play a crucial role alongside the biographic narrative about St. Nikolai and Vasily Sergeyevich Oshchepkov. The man you see, bottom or rightmost image, which is the actual practitioner and founder. To bolster a claim about Sambo techniques predating judo, Khlepetsky cites three sources of, quote, individual techniques of Russian national fighting, end quote. The first appears in the medieval folk epic Ilya Muromets and Idolishya, which describes the techniques that wrestlers use to this day, quote, known as throw with two legs. The old Cossack himself, Ilya Muromets, grabbed him, Idolishya, by the legs and dragged him down to the brick floor, end quote. Khlepetsky goes on to cite how, quote, in the 18th century, the compiler of an encyclopedia published in Berlin in 1794 described our national fighting as follows. The Russians have a custom to show their strength and agility in unarmed combat. They strive to grab and throw down one another, pulling down each other's legs, which is one of the main methods for defeating the enemy. End quote. Finally, Khlepetsky relates how, quote, ethnographer A. Tereshenko, describing everyday life in Russia in the 19th century, wrote, skilled wrestlers succeed not with strength, but with skill. A competitor tries to grab his opponent so that he loses his balance. Then he can boldly allow him to tumble down or throw him to the ground like a toy. Those who carefully read this book, or are at least a little familiar with the basics of Sambo, will immediately understand. In Russian national amusements, since olden times, existed tricks that laid the very essence of Sambo, end quote. So these historical references to tripping, throws, and leg lock techniques have a cumulative and mutually reinforcing character in Khlepetsky's work. The first citation provides history, ancient history, I suppose, deep history, as it cites a figure roughly equivalent to King Arthur in English legend, but with church recognition as a saint. That is Ilya Muromets. The fact his opponent in the quoted tale bears the literal name pagan idol and comes from the East provides additional separation from Japan, which of course is part of what Chlapetsky is up to. The second reference, simply to fighting from the Berlin Encyclopedia, adds the appearance of impartial foreign testimony, while the third reference from a Russian ethnographer universalizes these proto-techniques of Sambo, or techniques of proto-Sambo, as a part of Russian village recreation and of a traditional kind of known thought to write down or categorize as a distinct martial art at the time. Such efforts at locating Sambo in the Russian cultural inheritance, though only 2 pages of the book, are a major part of Chlapetsky's new origin of Sambo, beyond simply the biography of Shchepkov. Now, they're really unpersuasive on their own, but at the same time they fit the pattern that historian Sarah J. Panzer describes in German efforts at absorbing Japanese, quote, secret or special knowledge about combat by presenting it as a forgotten piece of the Germanic cultural inheritance, end quote. Now, Chlapetsky makes only one major effort to link Sambo and Orthodoxy beyond Shchepkov's general biography. First, the biographic element essentially presents Shchepkov's trajectory from age 12 as an orphan in the Russian Far East. Facing deportation by the Japanese occupation authorities in 1905, Shchepkov found refuge, then direction, and really a surrogate father with St. Nikolai and his Russian Orthodox Church mission in Japan. The biographic link culminates in 1911 when Shchepkov graduates from the mission's theological seminary and then begins training at the Kokodan Judo Academy of Jigoro Kano with St. Nikolai's blessing. Finally, Chlapetsky relates how in 1929, after realizing that he can create his own martial art to surpass judo, Shchepkov has a supernatural encounter on a train that's taking him from the Russian Pacific coast to Moscow. A Russian saint, Seraphim of Sarov, who died in 1833, enters a train car and interrupts Shchepkov's thoughts about technique to reveal a greater destiny. Quote, much can be found in the works of ancient Russian literature, national epics of other nationalities of the Russian Empire, and of course, in the writings of the Holy Fathers of the Church. Strengthened by the foundations of faith, the Russian character is the spiritual basis of our martial arts. Have you not been taught since childhood that man was created in the image and likeness of God? Who else, if not the Creator, can plant these powerful physical and spiritual creative forces in a person? That's, of course, him relaying St. Seraphim's speech to Shchepkov. He goes on to narrate, the not so old, strong, thin fingers of Father Seraphim lay on Shchepkov's hand. From this touch, it was as if an electric charge ran through the whole body of Vasily Sergeyevich Shchepkov. And then Seraphim continued, the Russian people should be helped to embrace these powerful forces, to make them act. The work bequeathed to you by St. Nikolai of Japan is one of the very important ways to do this. Your whole life was only preparation and testing. Now you are ready. End quote. So the vision St. Seraphim provides to Shchepkov, or of course Chlapetsky provides to us, is really the central innovation in the text, which otherwise doesn't do very much to revise the post-Soviet narrative one can already find on the website of the Russian Sambo Federation. A narrative, of course, that involves other people is much more perhaps mundane, certainly doesn't involve supernatural visions. And this passage of St. Seraphim appearing in a train, as much as the book itself reflects the efforts of the Russian Orthodox Church to engage in the discursive construction of martial arts that Paul Bowman identifies. Unlike most other efforts, however, ROC striving to reshape Sambo requires not only limiting what moved from east to west, right, essentially with judo, but what moved through time, because Russian Orthodox missionaries in Japan, I would argue, provide a less problematic site for Sambo's origins than Soviet Russia at the height of Stalinist cultural revolution. Chlapetsky thus addresses the spiritual rather than national element of all the other things, as Bowman calls them, that concerned the Church about Sambo's emergence from Japan and Japanese martial arts. In 2010, a press conference saw Chlapetsky join with a church official from the Department of Relations between Church and Society and one from the Russian Olympic Committee to announce the beginning of the ROC project to, quote, develop a common ideology of Sambo, end quote. With this really understated event, the ROC informed the country that it would use its resources to support Sambo and use the media to reshape public perception of Sambo. I treat the media coverage in the decade that has followed as precisely the type of constitutive role media plays in teaching the public about martial arts and combat sports that Bowman highlights in his study of media representations of MMA fighters in Britain. With Sambo, the 100th anniversary of St. Nikolai's death in 2012 provided an occasion for commemorative events that garnered media attention, including a trip by the Patriarch to Japan. The main reception in Japan provided the Patriarch with a broad platform to promote the ROC's ideas about Sambo, which included the distribution of advanced copies of Chlapetsky's book, which otherwise came out in 2013 or was distributed in 2013. Media outlets, by covering this event, presented an Orthodoxy Sambo connection that was invented in a book that the Patriarch had commissioned as background to the story. So the media covered that as just, oh, by the way, this book is there, as part of covering the Patriarch's trip. And this was a rather small change initially, but of course, media coverage would continue to link Sambo to the ROC without further mention of the process of emergence from judo during the Soviet era. Now, after the 2014 Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, Patriarch Kirill was ready to inaugurate his Patriarchal Commission on Physical Culture and Sports. In his opening remarks, he cited 1 Corinthians before explaining that church leadership would ensure that both athletes and soldiers, in a rather abrupt pairing, would preserve their humanity because, quote, man cannot turn into a beast. This is how an Orthodox warrior always differed from a pagan warrior, end quote. And of course, Buddhism would count as paganism. Thinking of Eastern religions, not of paganism and what was happening in Northeastern Europe in the 9th century. Now, his focus, after talking about these broad themes, returned to sports as he concluded by claiming the similarity of athletes and Christian ascetics, whether monks or martyrs, in discipline and feats of self-denial, which provide the foundation for the church's interaction with sports in Russia. Sambo received little specific mention, but its inclusion could hardly be in doubt given the Patriarch's past promotion of Shepkov and mention of historical warriors, in some ways, of course, echoing Chlapetsky's book. The future role of the ROC in promoting sports was unambiguous amid sprinklings of theology and a rather simplistic distinction between Sambo as defensive compared to other martial arts as attack-focused. Now, the ROC publicized its interest in Sambo from the first year of Kirill's elevation as Patriarch, but along with this new commission, turned to an established Russian exemplar, a type of hyper-visible martial body in Bowman's terms, beginning in 2015. Seeming to engage what Bowman has described as the ways that practitioners self-identify and, quote, what it is that fans or practitioners think and or say they are fans of or practitioners of, end quote. The church aimed to change fans' view of a Sambo champion, an MMA star in Fyodor Emelianenko, with media coverage that linked the martial art and the man to orthodoxy above all. Since 2015, he has given 3 lengthy interviews with Russian Orthodox magazine and television outlets. With no concern for subtlety, the edited transcript of his first interview begins with the question of how he would like a future encyclopedia entry about him to read. And Fyodor answered, quote, if after 100 years, I would like to be known only as an Orthodox Christian. In principle, all championship regalia, all titles, they're not valuable, but they cost a lot of effort, work, but are not so important in our life. I would like to be remembered only as an Orthodox Christian, end quote. So while Fyodor discussed coming to Jesus long after becoming a Sambo fighter, his sentiments perfectly echo the ROC's approach to sports as a means to an end, not the main thing. And when asked what kind of responsibility he had as an example to young men who see him as a hero and champion in a 2019 interview, he responded similarly, quote, being an Orthodox Christian imposes a responsibility on me, meaning not being a champion. Quote, for us, authoritative people should be those who have reached the kingdom of heaven, saints, while a person lives, there is a risk of falling short, end quote. And so with an intended audience of Russian Orthodox families, rather than specifically MMA fans, such media coverage of the former champion presents martial arts as a means for Christian men to practice humility, gratitude, and self-discipline. Now, whatever impact such ideas might have on actual teenagers, they situate Fyodor as a living counterpart to a Shepkov in the ROC's new narrative, or at least 2010's narrative, of Sambo as compatible with the faith. Now, the anxiety about boys' path to manhood, thinking about being example to teenagers, reflected larger social questions about conscription and the Second Chechen War, which lasted officially from 1999 to 2009, and those concerns were reflected by the fact that mothers had emerged as an activist group, soldiers' mothers in particular, just as they had during the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989. And as political scientist Maya Eichler has demonstrated, the Russian state's promotion of a militarized masculinity through endurance of the hazing of conscripts and, of course, their experience of combat were exactly what helped undermine the appeal of military service in the first decade of the 21st century. After Vladimir Putin's questionable re-election to the presidency, questionable in its authenticity, of course, just like the referendum recently, to the presidency in 2012, renewed concerns about the infantilization of boys and stifled manhood among those in their late teens entered public discussion, or perhaps returned to public discussion. The personal experience of Father Ivanov, a pioneering Siberian priest in Church-Sambo clubs, illustrated the role that Sambo could play in responding to the supposed crisis. Quote, this is quoting Father Ivanov, "After I returned from the army to my hometown, I continued martial arts training. Later, already being a priest, I once came to Sunday school and saw how the boys embroidered a cross. It confused me. I decided that for boys, this is not at all what they need. A man must be a man. I came to the conclusion that in Russia, combat Sambo should be taught for boys," end quote. And of course, among Patriarch Kirill-inspired clubs, rather than those like Ivanov's that emerged early that was in 2002, when he began his, priests explain how their training operation unfolds on Sundays under the broad premise that spiritual life is a struggle. It's a kind of slogan or something you put on banners. Quote, "We decided to start a Sambo section. We bought mats and put them down in the narthex. That means that it's 30 or 40 minutes of the law of God, essentially a kind of Sunday school textbook in Russia. Then kids go to train. That trainer priest has such a heart, and he loves to train youth and kids, and succeeds. Yet in parallel, masculine education takes place. So the juxtaposition of general education with the book, and then the masculine education of Sambo for boys. And of course, such clubs emerging after Patriarch Kirill's initiative in 2015 provide just that masculine path to adulthood that was such a concern after the Chechen War, and of course they do so before military service begins at age 18. In 2015, an abbot, head of a monastery in Saratov, started a martial arts club for boys in the basement of the main building of St. Nicholas Monastery. He trained Sambo and Judo before becoming a monk in 2001. His motives are typical of those clergymen forming such clubs after Patriarch Kirill began to promote Sambo and, of course, sports in general. Unlike secular martial arts trainers, the monastery does not charge for lessons, even for boys not attending the church. As the abbot explains his goals, quote, "Of course, it would be nice to introduce these guys not only to martial arts, but also to faith. But I don't try to restore them to the church," meaning if they'd stopped going to church after doing so initially as kids, "nor to impose faith on them. In this sense, I try to follow the example of St. Nikolai of Japan. He did not distinguish between a few Japanese believers in Christ and their unbelieving brothers, engaging equally with everyone instead," end quote. The abbot thus cites the ROC's narrative around Sambo and St. Nikolai, which speaks to its instrumental character and the success of Kirill's initiative, and perhaps to an extent Chlapetsky's book, in prompting more churches and clerics with martial arts experience to form Orthodox Sambo clubs. Beyond that impulse from the center, the goals of local Church-Sambo efforts appear to have a pragmatic rather than patriotic or political purpose. Abbot Tikhon follows up his comments to specify his aims more precisely. Quote, "It is one thing when a boy sees that his mother and grandmother go to church, and another when his peers in training next to him, and the older guys and coaches he knows are there too, grown men, male authority figures also going to church," end quote. Now, Tikhon's measure of Orthodox Sambo success may be as simple as more boys joining the parish and fewer young men leaving it, which of course addresses perennial concerns of both generational change and a gender gap in modern parish life. Now, building on the growth of local church clubs or schools, regional Orthodox Church hierarchs have raised the profile of Orthodox Church ties to Sambo by branching out with other youth organizations, and of course then holding Sambo competitions with them. And that's one of two main approaches: sponsoring amateur martial arts tournaments for youth that of course include non-church club Sambo practitioners, and the sponsorship means that the championship trophy will receive the name of a medieval warrior saint, such as in honor of Blessed Prince Michael of Tver. And these tournaments then will include opening remarks by a regional hierarch, whether a bishop or metropolitan, as well as the blessing of the competitors with holy water, and of course, group prayer, as well as a championship trophy that very specifically bears the saint's name. And the second approach, in some ways simply a supplement to that, is bringing boys and sometimes girls from church clubs to compete in non-church tournaments as part of their regional teams to simply demonstrate the effectiveness of church-based training. If kids trained in church clubs are winning secular tournaments, then that speaks to the training being substantial. And of course, a consistent stream of media coverage of these regional events, whether about the church clubs or, of course, about the church-sponsored tournaments, has the potential to normalize the idea that providing Sambo training and sponsoring competitions is just another part of church outreach and youth ministry. Now, Orthodox church clubs have been fairly self-conscious about their separation from other groups, whether teaching Sambo or having other patriotic or scouting roles that claim Orthodox affiliation. When a martial arts festival as a fundraiser for disabled youth took place in 2018, multiple Orthodox church media outlets covered the event using the phrase, or in their headlines, quote, "Sports rally, we together," Movmiest is the name of the event, "united Orthodox and secular teenagers," meaning teenagers in non-Orthodox church organizations. The reporting in those articles included the statement of one of the ROC-sanctioned organizations, noting how, quote, "Such a festival is a new experience of communication among adolescents. It helps their socialization in an Orthodox environment." As if to underscore the separate status of military patriotic clubs who are otherwise not regular participants in such an Orthodox environment. And of course, those distinctions didn't change the character of the event, but they suggest an awareness among Orthodox officials that youth groups with divergent values and quite different goals for Sambo or, of course, even combat training only claim religious affiliation, but don't actually have an Orthodox character to their clubs or, of course, for the youth themselves. Now, to conclude, before the coronavirus pandemic halted major sporting events in 2020, Sambo's public profile and number of practitioners was on the rise in Russia. This study of ROC's symbolic and financial investment in Sambo over the last decade has outlined the complexity and relative independence of Church-Sambo's methods and goals. While the Patriarch has regularly supported Russian President Vladimir Putin's foreign and domestic policies, the Sambo Initiative has not been an avenue for shared or even complementary efforts. Little in Orthodox Sambo rhetoric about masculinity could bolster the macho or mujik ideals that Putin performs for the media, as described in American political scientist Valerie Sperling's analysis of Putin's political legitimation strategy, which is heavily gendered. Direct church ties to the militias that Laurel rightly describes as a tool in aggressive and imperialistic use of force by Russia appear to exist only in militia rhetoric, while Church-Sambo clubs remain at arm's length for militaristic youth groups. Systema, as I guess a martial art with additional knife and firearms training, combining some Sambo techniques, has received no ROC sanction or historio-ideological support. And while gauche rituals of priests blessing military hardware and soldiers make for regular photo ops, the hierarch's support for foreign troop deployments does not appear to have translated to the parish level into parish-level Sambo clubs. The focus of grassroots Church-Sambo clubs on rearing civilian men of faith and not providing future conscripts with a head start for combat training appears to reflect the public sentiment, quote, between anti-militarism and remilitarization that Eichler identifies in Russia as a reaction to continued conscription after the Second Chechen War. And of course, media coverage appears to have aided the ROC's institutional and discursive efforts to form an Orthodox space in Russian Sambo, in which regional bishops or metropolitans, not Putin or the Sambo Federation officials, address, bless, and award young martial artists. So, I'll conclude there. Apologize for running long. Thank you for your patience / viewing.